And the family practice doctors came up with a term in 2002 called MUS, called medically unexplained symptoms. And what they're saying to people is that we know you're in pain, we know you have this, this, and this. We don't know the exact cause. We know you're suffering. Have a good life. We'll do the best we can do. It could not be farther from the truth. When you look in terms of fight or flight, your body's chemistry is completely explained, absolutely explained. Each organ system has its own function, its own response. That's why there's so many different physical and mental symptoms. But it turns out that anxiety, depression, OCD, bipolar, and schizophrenia are actually all inflammatory disorders.
Welcome to the Mindful Injury Recovery Talks with Dr. Maya Novak. Your host is a mindful healing expert and the author of the book, Heal Beyond Expectations, and this show is here to give you the extra resources you need when healing from any physical trauma. Tune into today's episode to get inspired and empowered. And before we start, here's a little known fact about Dr. Maya. Due to nervousness and fear of public speaking, it took her 6 hours to create her first live video on Periscope back in 2015.
There's another amazing conversation in front of us. Today, I'm joined by Dr. David Hanscom, who is an orthopedic spine surgeon whose practice focused on patients with failed back surgeries. He retired from his practice in 2019 to focus on teaching people how to break loose from the grip of chronic mental and physical pain with and without surgery. His approach to treating chronic pain is based on his personal experience with it, learning about medical practices you can apply yourself, and connecting to your own capacity to heal. He's the author of 2 books, Back in Control and Do You Really Need Spine Surgery? David, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm really excited about today's conversation because I know that not only you have theoretical knowledge, but you also have a lot of personal experience, especially when it comes to pain. And this is what makes things interesting. And this is also why I know that people will get a lot out of this episode. So let's talk slightly about your retirement and why did you decide to leave your practice in 2019? What was the main reason?
So, through my own personal experience, I learned tools based on neuroscience, basically the basic research of how to solve chronic pain. And it did not require surgery. If surgery was needed, great, we did it. But most of the time, probably 80% of spine surgery should not be done. So I was a complex spine surgeon. I took care of the worst cases. People had multiple surgeries before they got to me. And then it became increasingly apparent over my 30-year career that spines were being more and more surgerized, more damaged, horrendous problems. I had people with 5 and 10 operations pretty commonly. My record was one gentleman with 29 surgeries in 20 years. I had another woman who had 10 surgeries in 10 years, another person 15 surgeries in 18 months. And what happens is that the downside of a failed spine surgery is a nightmare. And I could do surgery to correct some of the problems, but I couldn't get people anywhere back to what they could be if they had never had surgery. Then when I would look at the original scans, there were surgeries done on normally aging spines. So what's happening when you do spine surgery, especially a spine fusion, you're actively damaging the spine. So I was seeing, then at the same time, I developed this process called the Direct Your Own Care Journey, the DOC journey, evolved over my long experience with myself and my patients. So using those tools, and we'll talk about that later, how to get out of pain, I was watching hundreds and hundreds of patients go to pain-free. And there is no risk, minimal resources required. And at the same time, I was seeing 3 to 5, sometimes 6 patients a week having really terrible things done to their spines. And the downside of a failed spine surgery is a destroyed life many times. So what people do not comprehend when you're the patient, you trust your surgeon, they're going to do the right thing. But the downside of a failed surgery is just catastrophic. A good share of the time, it destroys people's lives. So let me ask you a question. If you came to me with back pain for say like 2 years, You're very frustrated. You feel trapped. You just want to have something done. And in your mind, why surgery is held up as sort of the definitive answer. And I said, look, I'll do a lumbar fusion on you for your back pain, which is the standard of care. What percent success would you want to undergo that surgery?
Yeah, probably 100%, right?
Right. What if it was 80%?
Yeah. Well, not the best, but potentially I can imagine that some people would take 80% over potentially 0%.
What about 50%?
Oh, that's a tough one.
The actual success rate is 22%. So here's the problem. It's been very well documented in the spine literature that disc degeneration is a normal finding. So ruptured disc, herniated disc, bulging disc, bone spurs, arthritis are all considered normally aging processes. So we call it degenerative disc disease, and a much more accurate term would be a normally aging spine. And the reason why this is so critical is that disc degeneration in all its forms has never been shown to be a cause of chronic pain, period. So these are normal aging spines, so your spine is stiffer, but just because a disc loses water content and isn't as flexible does not mean it's a source of pain, and it is not. So it's so well documented that on every radiology report now, the radiologists have a phrase they put on there that these findings are consistent with a painless spine. So if you take 100 people off the street who have never had back pain, by the time you hit 65 years old, 100% of people have disc degeneration. And when you're 30 years old, maybe 25% of people have disc degeneration, but these people have no pain. So here we're doing an operation on a normally aging spine. It's a pretty big operation where you're actually stabilizing the spine, you're welding it together, you're creating scar tissue. Then what happens is spine starts breaking down above and below the fusions because you have a stress point. And so the disc above and below often breaks down, and that's where I come in as a salvage surgeon. And so you start climbing the spine. So the person that had 29 surgeries in 20 years started with a one-level discectomy. Then you had ongoing back pain, which, by the way, is not a result of the discectomy. So we had a one-level fusion, then two levels, then three levels. Then he got infected. So he eventually ended up being fused all the way from his neck to his pelvis. So it's just surgery after surgery after surgery, and it's become normalized. I mean, these young fellows that come out see this all the time. It's like part of their practice. So what I didn't realize is that the data came out in 1993 after about 8 years in practice. I thought the success rate was 90%. I was enthusiastic. I was a zealot. I'm one of the few surgeons who's truly been on both sides of this fence. So I was a guy who was doing the fusions. I was excited about it. We had new technology. And I looked at my data and I had about a 45% success rate. I'm going, huh. Then the data came out from the state of Washington that the success rate 2 years after a spine fusion for back pain was 22%. So I
Hmm.
just stopped. So I finally, then what happened about 10 years ago, the spinal deformity surgeons got into the game and they started assuming that scoliosis was a cause of back pain. There's no data. And so what's happening now, which is really a catastrophe for many, many people, is that people have a relatively minimal curvature of their spine or even a large curvature. It's never been documented to be a source of pain, ever. So now we're doing 1 and 2 level fusions that don't work. We're doing 8, 10, 12, 14 level fusions that don't work. The complication rate of a major spinal fusion is devastating. Blood loss, infections, all sorts of stuff happen. So now you have a stiff rod in your back. You can't twist or turn. You have a harder time bending, and it doesn't work. The pain is still there. So we're now doing even bigger operations that don't work. So I hit the threshold in 2018 where I walked into the room of a patient who was paralyzed by surgery, 32 years old, and I was making rounds, and I looked at the computer with my fellow. The guy didn't need surgery at all. So he's 32 years old, now paralyzed, and that was sort of my tipping point. I just said, enough. I'm just not going to do this anymore. So that's when I stopped. I quit my practice pretty much to do this. I'm not really retired. I quit. It was frustrating because I really loved spine surgery. I had a great team. We had many, many people getting better, mostly without surgery. Then the final part of this chapter is that I started doing what's called Prehab, where we just followed the data. We worked on people's sleep, their stress, their medication, their diet, just all the things that the literature says for us to do before any elective surgery. And 2/3 of my patients that needed surgery, these were structural problems with matching symptoms, canceled the surgery because the pain disappears. I had over 120 patients with severe spinal stenosis. Those are pinched nerves in the lower back. They had leg pain. They would have done well with surgery, but they came in for their final visit and the pain was gone. So I essentially, in a way, put myself out of business.
So
So
which is a good thing if you put
I did.
yourself out of the business, and the price is that you are really helping people, right?
Yeah, I was excited about it. I mean, in this pay structure, it was very awkward financially to deal with this. But yeah, watching people get better without any risk, no risk, and minimal resources. It's mostly a self-directed process by definition. And the number one factor that determines whether people get better or not is simply their willingness to engage. If people don't want to learn to take care of their own spines, own back, own pain, there's nothing I can do. However, the number one factor that predicts prognosis for getting better, and my chief of the pain service taught this to me, is simply willingness to engage.
And taking actually control over your own healing and taking responsibility. So not
Right,
looking outside for a magic pill, or I'm gonna, they're gonna do this surgery and then I'm gonna be perfect again.
right,
Yes.
right.
So, your personal story in regards to chronic pain, can you talk about a bit about this?
So I was a major spine surgeon, and in 1990, I was driving across the 520 bridge in Seattle. I'd been in practice for about 5 years, and I had a panic attack. And I'm going, what is this? So becoming a major spine surgeon means you're really tough, and I was. The nickname I had for myself was the brick, which is actually not a very complimentary term in retrospect, but I was really tough. So my attitude towards stress in general was bring it on, I can take it. And so I did. So I was under an incredible amount of stress, and I kept just doing my thing. I really had a badge of honor of taking on an infinite amount of stress. I did not know what anxiety actually was. And the reason why, in retrospect, I did not know what that was because I was so good at suppressing everything that I just honestly didn't experience that sensation. Then turns out I was a pretty angry guy in the form of perfectionism, which is a different topic. And I didn't recognize that either. So in general, I had a very, very fired up nervous system. So I went from no anxiety to a panic attack. So I thought anxiety was psychological. And what I didn't realize, and I now know from the neuroscience, that anxiety actually is the pain. So it's simply a physiological state. And what a panic attack is, your body just explodes with stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, inflammatory cytokines. Your heart races, you can't breathe, you feel like you're going to pass out. So that's actually a physiological process. And when I say physiology, I mean is how the body functions. And so what happens is that I went to psychotherapy for 13 solid years, which is a lot of psychotherapy. And my symptoms getting worse and worse and worse. So I had crippling anxiety to the point I had obsessive compulsive disorder, which is severe, very bad prognosis. I also had 17 different physical and mental symptoms. I had migraine headaches, my ears were ringing, my back hurt, my feet were burning, skin rashes were popping up all over my body, my stomach bothered me. So I had 17 different physical and mental symptoms, including anxiety, major depression, OCD, and nobody could tell me what was going on. And so again, I was pretty serious about getting better. I love my practice. I like what I was doing. And I picked up David Byrne's book one day in don't remember when this was exactly. And David Burns said, do this expressive writing. So I didn't know what that meant. I had no idea about the data. So I just simply started to write in a certain technique. And I thought it was the book, which is a great book, and the book is obviously part of it. Turns out the expressive writing is the one thing that started to break up the process. And even now, in people that heal, expressive writing is that one necessary step to actually start the process. And I have not seen people get better without it, just have not seen it. And there's a reason for that. And so within 6 weeks after I started expressive writing, I started feeling, this is better. Remember, this is after 15 solid years after trying everything. Then about 6 months later, due to personal circumstances, I had to come face to face with my anger issues. Now remember, I thought I was cool. I thought I was just fine. I was a cool spine surgeon. Nothing fazed me. So my self-image was that of not being angry, of actually being cool, calm, and collected. The reality was I was angry as anybody on this planet, and I was suppressing it. It turned out that suppressed anxiety and anger actually physically damage your brain. So it turns out repressed thoughts and emotions are actually more of a problem than expressed thoughts and emotions. And the genealogy of anger is a circumstance that you blame, and then you're a victim, and then you're angry. So the circumstance can be real or perceived. It can be just in your head. It could be for real. The brain doesn't know that. So the most deadly form of anger, which again I now recognize, is that I thought perfectionism was a virtue. I'm a spine surgeon. I have to be perfect, perfect, perfect. And the problem is that you're never perfect. So you're always so everything's less than perfect. So you're blaming yourself and the situation for less than perfect. Then you're a victim of less than perfect, and then you're always frustrated or angry. So what I thought was a virtue that quote took me to the top of the heap, which it did. I went to a major spine fellowship. I was quote successful, but I was sick. So what's success, by the way? That's a different conversation, but that perfectionism drove me to the top, but it took me right down the other side. And it's probably the biggest factor for a physician burnout right now is this self-critical voice, the perfectionism, because you're always a victim, you're always frustrated, and it drives you, but it also makes you sick. So it turns out that actually you don't need to be a perfectionist to be successful. In fact, it takes away energy you need to actually be successful. And it took me a very long time to hear that or learn that. But within 6 weeks after I came across this anger process and just confronted it, dealt with it very poorly back then, by I might say very poorly, very awkwardly, within 6 weeks, all my symptoms disappeared, all of them. And that was almost 20 years ago. And so I don't have OCD. I don't have depression. I don't have anxiety. The skin rashes are gone. I haven't had a migraine for at least 15 years. My ears don't ring. And over 50 million people in the United States have ringing in their ears, which is called tinnitus. Some people call it tinnitus. It's gone. I had it for 25 years. It's gone. And I was absolutely shocked. Never expected that ever. So it turns out that the problem that anxiety is actually a physiological state. It is not psychological. It's your survival reaction called fight or flight. So when you're threatened by anything, mental or physical, your body goes into fight or flight. So what happens when you're in fight or flight, as you know, you have adrenaline, cortisol, inflammatory cytokines, histamines. All these things are in play to keep your body fired up, including your nervous system. And so it turns out when your body's in a constant agitated state, every organ responds in its own way. That's why there's so many different symptoms. And so as you calm down the body's chemistry or the physiology, symptoms disappear. So I have seen hundreds and hundreds of patients improve. And again, the sequence that evolved came out of my own 15-year struggle out of pain. And I tried everything. Obviously, most things didn't work. But I started gravitating towards things that did work. And that's how what I call the doc journey evolved, was with my successes, my patients' successes. I had no agenda. I still don't. Even last week, things changed again. So the bottom line is I'm just following the science, following the literature. I'm doing what the literature says to do about calming people down, getting them to sleep, getting them exercises, and it works. So everything I'm presenting is not new news. Everything's in the literature. but it never was presented to me in a way I could apply to myself to prevent the problem in the first place. I'm still not that happy. I'm very grateful that I learned a lot to help other people. I'm still not that happy about losing 15 years of my life, literally. Cost me a marriage, cost me a practice. I mean, it was a disaster.
Well, David, I know that so many people can relate to this. First of all, if I go back to, and thank you for sharing your story in regards to how emotions, what kind of role they play in how the body reacts. Because how we were brought up was, when something happens or when you're in pain, you go to the doctor and then they are going to tell you what to do. But the conventional medical approach doesn't have all, it doesn't cover all the things that it would need to cover for the person
Right.
to really, get free from pain, from anxiety, from, whatever is happening. So I know that many people can really connect with your story right now. And I was when you were talking about being perfectionist, I can relate to that part as well. I would say, recovered perfectionist, even though I'm not going to say that I don't care anymore, right? But I know what was happening in the past, and I can so agree with you that emotions play such an important part when it comes to healing the body. And we do need to talk about more about this.
So I wanted to present a model that I call dynamic healing. And so what happens is that every living creature has the same process. So you have the planet Earth, that all its situations and circumstances. So every living creature has to assess the environment that it's in and take appropriate action to survive. And if they don't take appropriate action, of course, they don't survive. So what happens, you have the circumstances or stresses or the threats, that's the input. Then you have the nervous system itself that's processing all the sensory input. And then you have the output, which is the body's neurochemical state, or what we call physiology. So the body's physiology can exist in safety, which is rest and relaxation, anti-inflammatory proteins called cytokines, dopamine, serotonin, growth hormone, all these great chemicals in your body when you're in safety. Then in fight or flight, like we mentioned before, you have stress chemistry. The essence of every chronic disease, all of them, mental and physical, is sustained exposure to threat chemistry or threat physiology.
Yes.
So it's like driving your car down the freeway in second gear. It's high revolutions, it's revved up, it's going to break down. So sustained fight or flight is what breaks the body down. And again, it's physiological. And the family practice doctors came up with a term in 2002 called MUS, called medically unexplained symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're saying to people is that we know you're in pain, we know you have this, this, and this. We don't know the exact cause. We know you're suffering. Have a good life. We'll do the best we can do. It could not be farther from the truth. When you look in terms of fight or flight in body's chemistry, it's completely explained, absolutely explained. Each organ system has its own function, its own response. That's why there's so many different physical and mental symptoms. But it turns out that anxiety, depression, OCD, bipolar, and schizophrenia are actually all inflammatory disorders. I mean, half the brain is the immune system. It has glial cells with inflammatory receptors, cytokine receptors. So the brain's part of the immune system. So then we find out that Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cardiac disease, peripheral vascular disease, diabetes, obesity, osteoporosis, cancer, autoimmune disorders are all inflammatory disorders. It's all the same process. So again, if the problem with all chronic disease, including chronic pain, and by the way, including long COVID, is sustained exposure to fight or flight, then the way you solve the problem is that you minimize your time in fight or flight and you maximize your time in safety. So what you're doing when you're in safety, your body regenerates. You build up proteins, you put away fat stores, your whole body rest, we call it rest and digest. So what you're doing, you're allowing your body to heal itself. So there's a bunch of ways of doing that. So I call it dynamic healing. So you have the input or your stresses, you have your nervous system, and then you have the output. So the final part of this equation, which is huge for humans, what we have that other animals don't is language. So I think that language and consciousness is the essence of chronic disease. The reason for that is that we know that mental pain is processed in similar circuits as physical pain, shares the same circuits, you have the same physiological response. And the problem with unpleasant repetitive thoughts is the term is that you cannot escape them.
Yes.
So we're trapped by our thoughts. So we don't like our thoughts to be unpleasant. Emotional pain is as unpleasant as physical pain. And so we suppress them. Well, when you suppress them, it actually causes the hippocampus of the brain to shrink, the memory center, plus all sorts of other things happen. So whether you experience the thoughts or you repress them, it's the same problem. So every human being has this problem to some degree.
May I just interrupt you slightly, because what you are talking about now is very important, and this is something that I name this as a toxic positivity, because in the past, I don't know, a decade or so, there is so much, oh, you have to be happy, you have to be always in a good state. So a lot of times what can happen is that we push aside unpleasant thoughts or unpleasant emotions, and we are just playing as everything is perfect. But that doesn't mean that the body, doesn't keep the score, sort of
Right,
say. So
right.
we cannot be in this toxic positivity and just behave as everything is perfect. And if we behave as everything is perfect, then everything is going to be great, right?
No, I had not heard that term, but I totally agree with that. Is that I think positive thinking is a disaster. It really is a way of suppressing negative thinking. It's a disaster. So I like that term, toxic positivity. So it turns out thoughts, negative thoughts, unpleasant thoughts, disturbing thoughts are sensory input that you cannot escape from. Then it goes into your nervous system, which is either calm or hyperactive. Then it comes out as threat physiology. So the problem is with thoughts you can't escape from them. So you're in fight or flight a good share of the time. And so what you do is called dynamic healing. You have the input, the nervous system, and the output. So the physiology are your emotions. That's what you feel. So thoughts are input. Your emotions or what you feel is your physiology. At least that's my particular breakdown of it. And so when you suppress these unpleasant thoughts, you really fire up your physiology. So it's a whole different topic about obsessive thought patterns that we might talk about on a different podcast, but it's a big deal. So there's a connection in the brain between your thinking centers called the neocortex and the lower part of the brain called the limbic system, the survival brain, that Dr. Epkarian out of Chicago showed that when that connection exists on functional or research MRI scans, that if a person has a new injury, that they will have chronic pain 80% of the time.
Hmm.
So that connection predicts the future physical pain. So my contention is, why is that there? So I think it's human consciousness. And what makes it worse is that these thoughts and concepts become embedded in our nervous system, the same as a book or car or curtains. Concrete is a concrete set of things in your brain that become your version of reality. So then we start taking our life is determined by our concepts and thoughts. We take our behaviors and our life is run on our concepts and thoughts. And a lot of them are distorted, which is a big problem. And you end up with fight or flight most of the time. So again, every chronic disease, and we could go through the list one by one, has the same source. It's the same problem of sustained levels of fight or flight. So it turns out that we're in fight or flight. How do you feel? You feel anxious.
Hmm.
So anxiety is just a word that describes your chemical state. And then Dr. Stephen Porges, who I've worked with about the polyvagal theory, is that we're trying to get rid of the word anxiety, just saying activated threat response. It's just a word that describes your chemical state. It is not the cause of pain. It is the pain.
Yes, and I just want to acknowledge this, that when someone is injured after an accident, or if the pain comes out of nowhere, even though we both know that out of nowhere doesn't exist, right? there
Right.
is a lot of emotional turmoil all happening. So a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, a lot of doubts, worries, and then people go to the doctor, to the surgeon, and then they tell them worst case scenarios because
Right.
this is what we have to hear, everything that could go wrong. So then they're sent back home to wait and hope that everything is going to be okay. And they are left
Right.
alone with all
Right.
these thoughts and everything. And of course, no wonder that the data shows that 80% of people will end up with chronic pain.
Right. So I want to just tweak the conversation a little bit. So you
Yes.
use the word guilt, shame, fear. So those are thoughts. And then what happens, I'm sorry, fear in my mind is another word for anxiety. So
Yes.
again, that's just an activated response. So when you feel guilty, ashamed, et cetera, that's those rational thoughts. So you have this fired up nervous system, and these thoughts start flying out like crazy. So when your nervous system's fired up, it actually creates more thoughts than the unpleasant thoughts. Then the unpleasant thoughts fire up the nervous system. You've got a bidirectional problem here. And so that's the problem in the human existence. I call it the curse of consciousness, is that you cannot escape your thoughts. So that's the essence of the doc journey process, is learning how to regulate your body's physiology. You cannot control your thoughts, but you have a lot to say over your physiology. So here's the kicker of the whole process. And I learned this from a friend of mine, Dr. Bruce Lipton, who I knew this, but he stated it very, very clearly, is that anxiety and anger are neurochemical states. They're automatic. They're hardwired. It's how we survive. They are a million times stronger than your conscious brain. It's a 1,000,000 to 1 ratio.
Hmm.
So my cat has the same reflex. She just doesn't have a word for it. So they're massive, hardwired, powerful circuits. You cannot deal with them with rational means. You cannot control them. His point being, you can't control them. We have no say over them. So you might as well be talking to the hard drive of your computer to try to deal with these things. But they're also a gift. It's how we stay alive. So if you didn't have anxiety and anger, you wouldn't be alive. So they're necessary for survival, but they're unpleasant. They're supposed to be unpleasant. They're not responsive to rational means. So how do you decrease anxiety? And the answer is you simply lower your threat physiology. So again, the unconscious brain processes about 40 million bits of information per second. The conscious brain processes about 40. It's a 1,000,000 to 1 ratio. So the two parts to healing are, you become, I call it, professional at living your life, which means you separate your identity from this massive survival reaction. It's not who you are, it's what you have. You develop what I call a working relationship with it. And so as you learn the tools to calm it down, then the anxiety starts to drop. What doesn't work are things like self-esteem, because you're dealing your rational brain, a 1,000,000 to 1 ratio. And I think that one of the major issues of human experience, if not the major issue, is this thing called self-esteem. So
Hmm.
you're using these thoughts and self-concepts to deal with these survival circuits. It's a complete mismatch. Plus, when you get into self-esteem, it's a judgment pattern. Always judging yourself as better than or worse than, and there's no endpoint to it. So that's where you get this fired up nervous system. Your brain becomes inflamed. With the repetition, these reactions become memorized, and so you end up in a chronically agitated state,
Yes.
and there's no escape. So when people say you're losing your mind, it's not so funny, because half your brain's the immune system. It has receptors for what's called cytokines, they're inflammatory molecules, and half your brain is what's called glial cells, which are the supporting structures of the neurons in the brain. And so when your body's in fight or flight, those glial cells in the brain become inflamed. Your whole nervous system becomes inflamed. Your neurotransmitters go from calming to excitatory. So your nervous system is fired up. The speed of nerve conduction is fired up. We know that fear of pain actually makes the pain worse. Then you go to your doctor that you just pointed out, who's not telling you great news, which fires you up even more, which makes the pain worse. But that's the beauty of those of this whole process is that once you understand the problem, it is so solvable. It doesn't sound solvable this very second, but it's not so hard to solve.
Yes. Oh, I love this because it's so important that we talk about mind body connection and how important it is to, so how to support the body. The conventional
Right,
medical approach is take some pills to reduce the pain, and this is how you're supporting the body. But actually, we support the body by doing everything that you are talking about here. So, talking
right,
about emotions, processing emotions, dealing with unpleasant thoughts, and not pushing them aside in regards to, oh, I shouldn't have these thoughts or emotions, but just dealing with them. This is
right.
how we support the body.
And not suppressing them either.
Yes,
So I want to go back to your thing about toxic positivity. So the whole healing journey is actually anchored in skepticism and doubt.
yes,
That makes sense?
yes.
And people look at me and go, what? Okay, so look, you've tried everything, nothing's worked. You've heard David Hanscom, you've heard Maya, and they have these ideas that sound good, but nothing else has worked. Why would this work? That's what's real. You have to connect with what's real in your body to connect to its capacity to heal. So all we're asking you to do is that it's not about generating belief in David Hanscom's process or your process or some book. Or it's not about generating belief in anything because it doesn't work. Again, it's a 1,000,000 to 1 mismatch. So what does work is connecting to your own body's capacity to heal, which means connecting with what's real. So what's real is doubt and skepticism and anger and frustration. So you have to connect to that actually in order to heal and stay there.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's life. Your brain's always looking out for danger. That's your baseline state. It's looking for danger. Your brain's programmed to survive. It is not programmed to have a good time. So there's two parts to healing. One part is learning how to develop a working relationship with these survival reactions, anger and anxiety. And so those are over here. You separate your identity from that. Then the other part of healing is that you move your brain into a place that you want to live. What do you want your life to look like? So you have to decide what you want your life to look like and move that direction. So a positive outlook is much different than positive thinking. So what do I want? How do we want to get there? And when you're not fighting anxiety and frustration every second, then you actually have the space in your brain to create what you want. As you create this new life that's enjoyable, fulfilling, that's the healing. That's the true healing, is that you're not going to actually get this life unless you practice it.
Yes.
So one metaphor I use is developing a new language is that you're not going to learn French by trying to fix your English. Same thing with your brain. You're not going to learn what I call an enjoyable life because your default language is survival. So you keep working on these survival reactions, which are infinitely deep and powerful. How are we going to fix those?
So let me ask you about, I so agree with you, but I also know that some of people will say now that they are listening, they're going to say, yeah, but you don't understand my life. I have XYZ things. There is so much stress in my life, and kids and family and job and other relationships and so on and so on. So how can I start actually taking care of this since I don't know where to start? Do you have any advice for those people?
Yeah, I do. That's why developers called the Doc Journey. We have an app and the course, and you can't go from that life to an enjoyable life without a sequence. In other words, you have to calm the brain down. You have to give yourself some space to learn. You have to I recommend people do it like 15 minutes a day at the most. And so it's like learning how to play the piano or any musical instrument or any performance of any kind. It takes repetition, repetition, repetition. So remember the stress that's the most stressful is the stress that you can't control.
Mm-hmm.
So guess what? Everybody has this problem. This is universal, number one. Second of all, one of my mentors pointed out very clearly that the human brain is not designed to process this much sensory input every day. We evolved in the prairie, the hills, the mountains, nature. We sat around campfires and had rhythm and dance. We had community. So we're in concrete jungles. We're isolated from people. All those are inflammatory. So our human brain, that's why this is so universal. That's why we're having so much trouble with anxiety at every level, especially in teens and people in their 20s, is that our brains are not evolutionary standpoint geared to process data at this rate. So all of us have the same problem. So the sequence is the dynamic healing model. You have the input, the nervous system, and the output. So remember, the only goal here isn't to solve all your stresses. You can't do that. Because remember, the stresses that are most stressful are the ones you can't control.
Hmm.
So, but what you can do is find ways to regulate your body's physiology, and you have more energy actually to deal with the problems you have to deal with because life doesn't go away. It keeps coming at you. People want their pain to go away and be done. Well, pain's there every day. That's part of life. You would not exist without pain. So, what you learn to do, I call it becoming a professional at living your life. So, let's go through the three portals. The first one is the output or the physiology. So, when you're feeling stressed and anxious, that's just reflecting your physiology, not psychological. So, things like deep breathing, slow breathing actually stimulate what's called the vagus nerve, which is highly anti inflammatory. We know that humming actually stimulates the seventh cranial nerve, which stimulates the vagus nerve. People can rub their forehead, stimulates the fifth cranial nerve, which again is close to the 10th cranial nerve, which is the vagus nerve. Certain pitches of music, like lullabies, actually again stimulate the vagus nerve and calm things down. So there's things you can physically do to actually stimulate the anti-inflammatory response to the vagus nerve. The second factor of the nervous system, remember there's the input nervous system and the output. So if you come from an abusive environment, your nervous system is hyperactive.
Hmm.
So your brain was programmed that a lot of things in life are dangerous because they were dangerous when you were a kid or perceived as dangerous. That's your life filter. And many of you know about what's called the ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences. And that's things like physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, parent in prison, parent on drugs, etc. And just having a high ACE score predicts really bad health, including a shorter lifespan. Why is that? We are programmed about many things in life being dangerous because they were dangerous. That filter doesn't change as you become an adult. So your nervous system's hyperactive most of the time. So what you do with the nervous system is ways of calming that down so it's less hyperreactive. The metaphor I like to use is that of a feral cat, which is hyperactive, hyper alert, which it has to be, compared to a domestic cat, which is completely spoiled. So it's one of those things where you can learn how to calm down your nervous system. So anti-inflammatory diet makes a big difference. Exercise and sleep is huge. Without sleep, people just don't heal. So people say, well, I'm in chronic pain, I can't sleep. The data shows actually that lack of sleep actually causes chronic pain, causes it. It's not the other way around. So what happens at nighttime if you're not sleeping, while your brain doesn't clean out the waste products, it doesn't filter things correctly, it doesn't regenerate, it doesn't relax. So sleep is a big deal. And so what you're doing is you increase the resiliency of your nervous system. It takes more stress to set off fight or flight. So again, the final thing is not final thing. So a big factor with the nervous system is trauma therapy. And so some people's trauma, mine was pretty bad, but it's not as bad as some of the stories I hear, which are just horror stories beyond words. So you can't fix that. You have to rebuild your brain. You can't rebuild a burned down house with the same timbers. So literally a good trauma therapist will help people reconstruct their nervous system to feel safe. So talk therapy doesn't work, sort of reinforces it, but a skilled trauma therapist can make a big difference.
May I just interrupt slightly? You said the talk therapy doesn't work. Can you just explain a bit about this? Because I'm sure that some people are hearing this the first time, and now, if they are in therapy, they're a bit potentially worried. So, can you slightly explain why talk therapy doesn't work?
So obviously with any therapy there's talking involved. So the key issue is this person helping you feel safe? So we call it somatic experiencing or somatic therapist. So obviously you have to use words to talk. But if you just want to talk about your past and just understand it, nothing changes. In fact, it actually reinforces the patterns. So I am not a proponent of going back and analyzing all your trauma every time. So when you're triggered, you're triggered. So the skill set comes in processing the triggers quickly, not going back in the past and trying to solve every trigger. So the past is done. You can't change it. You can't fix it. You can't do it. So again, my perspective comes from, and I respect psychiatrists and psychologists a lot. I think they're really helpful, but it depends on their approach.
Mhm.
So the key issue is feeling safe. So you go through the trauma that you went through, you allow yourself to feel it, and then come strategies to deal with it. But just talk therapy alone actually just reinforces the circuits. So remember, the way you live a good life is that you have to practice it. So that brings us to the next aspect of it, of the input about what do you put into your nervous system that fires up the physiology. So one of the most powerful things that's evolved in our process is that we do not let people discuss their pain or their medical care at all. But also no complaining, no giving unasked for advice, no criticism, no malicious gossiping. Because what's that doing to your brain? You're just putting in input that is firing up your physiology. So when you're just talking about your past, analyzing your past, your brain's on the problem, not the solution.
Mhm.
So, and it's interesting because we found out through our workshops, in our apps based on our workshops, people would go to pain free within 3 to 5 days almost every time. About 80% of the people went to pain free. But one of the cardinal rules that we had was simply you cannot discuss your pain or your medical care and no complaining. And people, so that's where we found that people in pain probably spend 60 to 70% of their conscious hours discussing their pain or medical care
Yes.
or being critical or whatever. So I get it. I was one of those people. I did the same thing. I call myself an epiphany addict. You're desperate. You're looking for a solution after solution after solution, and it doesn't work. So not discussing your pain, by the way, not watching violent movies or watching the news also is input that fires up the nervous system. So by not discussing your pain or medical care, you're actually changing the input dramatically. It's hard to do. People actually look at me and go, well, what do I talk about? Or at our workshops, people would actually sneak up behind the buildings to talk about their pain. It's like smoking cigarettes in high school.
Mhm.
So you're so used to doing it as a behavioral pattern, you actually bond with other people in chronic pain. And we also know data that shows that one of the worst prognoses for fibromyalgia is belonging to a fibromyalgia support group.
Yes.
Because discussing the pain, same thing with eating disorders. You're discussing all these problems. So the question is, what do you want? Do you want to stay in the victim role? Do you want to keep talking about your pain? Or do you actually want to move forward? Again, the problem is a learned skill set. This is all a learned skill set. Again, that's why the sequence is what it is. So that's input. There's another exercise called expressive writing, which I've talked about a lot before.
Yes.
And Dr. James Pennebaker published the first paper in 1986. Since then, there have been over 2,000 papers documenting the effectiveness of what's called expressive writing.
May I ask you, this expressive writing, is this the same as journaling or diary
No,
writing, or what is the difference here?
huge difference. So with expressive writing, you simply write down your thoughts, any of them. The more clear, the better, and tear them up instantly. So journaling is trying to analyze things and try to see who you are as a person, which is actually quite counterproductive. So remember, you can't escape your thoughts. So what I think, again, this is my explanation, is that the thoughts are on the piece of paper, you're here, and you tear them up for two reasons. You have to tear them up, shred them, burn them, whatever you want to do. Is that you're separating from your thoughts, cannot control them. It's just an exercise. And as you write, all these issues come up. Well, they're not issues, they're just thoughts. So it's these stories in our life that we create about ourselves that actually keeps the nervous system fired up. We call it self-esteem or whatever. Then when you journal to see all these issues, it's very, very counterproductive. So one of my favorite pain specialists pointed out really clearly that if you hold on to your writing, you're holding on to your pain. So they're just thoughts. It's just a separation exercise. Now you can do it verbally. You can do it on the computer. Dr. Burns has a technique called the 3 column technique. So you can do creative writing, just expressing to the world how you feel. But if you're journaling to sort of analyze yourself and fix yourself and really understand yourself, that's a huge problem.
So, if we give people right now like more like a hands-on work, really like step by step, how to do this expressive writing, since you are mentioning that it's really good to tear apart the piece of paper, it's better probably to have a journal or just a piece of paper, and then write down whatever comes up to your mind. Am I
Right,
hearing correctly? Yeah.
right.
And then after you pour out everything, you burn it, tear it apart, do whatever you want to do, just not keeping it, because keeping it, you're kind of also try to keep the pain.
Yep. Well, it's interesting how hard it is for people to do this. Because see, the problem is we identify with their thoughts. Why wouldn't we? All of us do this. I'm not trying to be lecturing here. I mean, I have the same issue. But I will tell you, after 15 solid years of severe chronic pain, I mean, I was suicidal a big part of this time. Within 2 weeks after I started the writing, I felt the shift. With all my patients, it's not the solution, but you talked about, well, how do we do this? How do I do this? Well, that's the sequence. So the three things is, let me cover one more process here called active meditation or mindfulness.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about input. So what expressive writing does, it changes the input, so you're diverting the thoughts. So you're simply separating from the thoughts, so you've now changed the input. So mindfulness, or what I call active meditation, just for 3 to 5 seconds throughout the day, you just put your brain on a different sensation. Like just right now, just drop your shoulders, sit in the chair. That's it. So you're just simply changing from racing thoughts to a different sensation. So again, as you change sensations, you have less impact on your nervous system and you're less fight or flight. The final one I'll cover, and there's many more parts to this, is forgiveness or letting go of the anger. 90% of people in chronic pain are still angry at the situation or person that caused the problem in the first place. But the person that they're most angry at is themselves. So where does that stop? So what you're holding on to fires up the nervous system, and we know the deadly nature of anger. But what we don't know is anxiety is an activated threat physiology. Anger is a hyperactivated threat physiology. So no matter how legitimate your anger is, it's still going to destroy your body. And it does. So I don't like the word forgiveness anymore because it's too big of a word. But there's ways of processing anger. Again, it's in the Doc Journey. And so it's one of those things where you learn how to simply process anger, watch what's going on, watch the distortions, watch the effect it's having on you. It's all based on awareness. And so as you learn how to change that input, again, things drop down. So again, with the dynamic healing model, you can change input by not discussing your pain, by changing sensations, by letting go of anger. With the nervous system, you can increase the resiliency with diet, exercise, sleep, and trauma therapy. And then with the physiology, you can directly lower it through very specific techniques stimulating the vagus nerve. So the key issue is this happens every day, multiple times a day. It's not like it's one and done. So some days your stresses are huge and you're going to buckle. I mean, no question about it. I mean, certain stresses you just can't deal with on a given day. That's fine. But how long do you want to stay there? How do you pull yourself out of the hole? So maybe an hour, maybe a day, maybe a week, maybe a minute. So you just learn tools to go from fight or flight back into safety. It becomes very automatic with repetition. And that's when life starts to change, is that when you're not in fight or flight most of the time, your brain becomes creative again. You have better energy and options to actually solve the problems that are stressing you out. So not only do people come out of chronic pain, their anxiety drops through the floor, their activity drops down, but they also become very creative. They start thriving at a level they never knew was possible. That includes me. So I was as bad as it gets. I mean, I don't think I had the trauma some people have. And I do think some people are so badly traumatized, they're so fragile, it's hard for them to engage. And again, that's a different topic, but there are ways of actually helping those people that are incredibly traumatized to feel safe. So they're not ready for the doc journey. You have to get them on board to allow themselves to feel any pain at all, because their pain is so horrible that they can't actually face it at all. So that's a different topic. But yeah, if somebody decides to engage in the process and learn how to calm down their nervous system, calm down their physiology, And I call become a professional at living your life, which means you process stress more skillfully, you nurture joy more consistently. They're separate skills, but they're linked to course. In other words, if you're using joy to counteract the massive survival circuits, that's what doesn't work. If you're using self esteem to counteract these survival circuits, that doesn't work either. So they're two separate skill sets, and they become very automatic with repetition. Again, we have a very consistent result with engagement, but if you don't engage, of course, nothing changes.
Yes. So would you then agree everything that right now you explained is that when we are healing the body, it is important to also deal with past trauma that at first glance it doesn't have any connection to right now, to this trauma, to this physical trauma. But when we do deal with this, or when we are working on dealing with this, the body does respond, because that's how we are calming the nervous system down. Would you agree?
So I'm going to say something that's very controversial. So you've heard the term how the body keeps a score, how
Yes.
trauma is stored in your body.
Yes.
So I completely disagree with that. Your body just responds to threats in a very generic manner. So you're in fight or flight, adrenaline, cortisol, your whole body fires up. It is what it is. What is stored in your body is your filter, your life lens. So if you're a program that the life is dangerous, that program becomes embedded. So what happens, you have a very reactive nervous system. That's what the trauma does to you. It creates a very hyperactive nervous system. So the beauty of that is once you become aware of the traumas, you actually can create a new life. You actually can construct a new life. So you don't have to be a victim of your past traumas, but you can see what they've done and actually construct a new life. So what I dislike, I mean, the terminology is somewhat misleading because people feel like I'm traumatized, I'm a victim, I can't come out of it. That's not true. All of us have trauma. Some people extreme trauma. Some people are so damaged it's hard to come out of it. By the way, my psychologist years ago gave me a book called Damaged, implying that I was so damaged I would never get better. I mean, my situation was pretty darn bad. Not as bad as some people's, but bad enough. So the trauma causes your life lens to be distorted. And the beauty of it is you can change that. That's what you can change. So you can actually create any life that you want. So what I don't do anymore is that if somebody's triggered or upset, if you're going back and trying to analyze where the triggers are coming from, you're actually reinforcing those circuits. You're going the wrong direction. You're on the problem, not the solution. So the solution comes in developing that skill set to minimize your time in fight or flight and maximize your time in safety. And so when you're triggered, you're triggered. So we tend to look and say, well, this trauma where my mother treated me like this, or my father did this, or my sister did this, we tend to keep going back to that trauma. There are trillions of triggers in life because we're programmed by every second of our life. So it doesn't really help to identify maybe that's the trauma, maybe this is the trauma. All I know is I'm triggered right now, this very second. That's a sum total of my life experience somehow get manifested right this second. So, okay, that's fine. If I happen to understand the role of trauma in my life, that's fine. I think I said before I went through 13 solid years of psychotherapy trying to understand my past, and I did, but I got worse because I was focusing on the trauma and the problem, not using tools to feel safe. So remember, once you can actually auto-regulate or regulate your own body's physiology, it's game on. You can take on anything, and you are safe because you have control.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing this. Now, before we're going to slowly wrap up, even though I know that we could be talking for hours, right? So let me just ask you this. You talked about this whole journey and what to do and how to do it. You very much connected it to chronic pain, to chronic disease. If someone is right now acutely injured, so an accident happened just a week ago or 2 weeks ago, does this process help as well, or should they do something else?
Well, going back to that whole part of the process, that there's a link in the brain between your thinking centers and the survival centers, that when that link is there, you'll develop chronic pain with a new injury 70 to 80% of the time. So it does help. Well, first of all, to me, anxiety is the pain. So even though you don't have chronic pain, most people have stress and anxiety. So the process really helps us live your life more carefully. Second of all, 50% of people that have that acute injury go on to chronic pain. 50%. So that's a person that you don't want to be. So yeah, for acute pain, technically, you don't need this stuff. Except what if that person has a fired up nervous system that develops chronic pain off a simple injury? So the answer indirectly is yes.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Now, before we finish, I do have two fun questions for you that I ask
Okay.
every guest.
Okay.
And the first question is, what is your number? Well, this is not so much fun, but it is in that category. So, what is your number one advice that you would give someone who is recovering from any kind of physical trauma?
Just have hope. This is a solvable problem. Period.
And if someone right now is losing hope, how to get hope back?
Well, again, that's the whole topic of today's discussion. And again, that's the sequence in the doc journey is that you start with simple things. Again, embrace the disbelief. That's the key issue. Don't try to believe anything. Just say, okay, I'm in trouble, deep trouble. I don't see any hope. And that's why I call it the abyss because it's so dark in there. I was there for many years. When I listen to my patients describe how frustrated and trapped they are, I go, there's no words for this. It's just the darkest place in the planet is where you're trapped in chronic pain. So I call it the abyss. And the point is just do something. Just expressive writing, some breath work, just to get your brain back online a little bit. It's like splitting a log. You're going to just get that wedge started and allow the log to split open as you keep working on it. So the key is embrace your disbelief. You don't have to generate hope. You're just going to have to just do something, whether you feel like it or not.
This is great advice. Now, David, if you were stuck on a desert island with an injury and you could bring only one thing with you to help you heal amazingly well, what would that be and why?
Of course, that would be my book,
Which one?
Back in Control.
Good. Okay. And why would that be? Why would you
Well, I
take
mean,
your book?
I'm going to sound extreme here for a second. So people look at stress as the problem. It's not stress, it's your reaction to it. So I'm being semi-serious, but semi-obviously kidding. But once you understand the tools of how to process stress, you can take on anything. And so the most extreme example, and I'm pretty sure I could not do this, but you've heard of this book called Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl.
Hmm.
Okay, he was in a concentration camp. He's a psychiatrist. He's an Austrian psychiatrist. And in the middle of this horrible, unspeakable situation, which cannot be worse than this human planet, he had hope. He generated hope. He healed. And he lived to be 90 years old, lived a thriving life. And he was, of course, lucky he survived, but he generated hope right in the middle of a concentration camp. So it's a remarkable story. It's unusual, but also demonstrates that anybody can generate hope regardless of your circumstances. So yeah, learning those tools actually just changes your life, whether you're in a desert island, middle of New York City, whatever you are, you can generate hope.
Great. David, where can people find more about you and your work?
So I think the best place is is called backincontrol.com. One word, back, BACKNIN, control, CONTROL.com. And that's sort of the landing place where all my resources are. So if you click the resources page, you'll see the Doc Journey app, the Doc Journey course. The app is based on my wife's input on my workshops, which is based on play, which is also a neurochemical state, which we could talk about someday at some time. So the app is very engaging and interesting. And then the Doc Journey course is a bit more academic. Both of them have the same sequence of learning how to get online, calm down, move forward. And then I have coaching that I do twice a week. That's part of the process, part of the either one of the app or the course. Then on that page, you'll see everything that I do, which is probably too much. We've talked about that. I've a blog for Psychology Today, which has now over 1 million views on it. I have lots of things on that resources page that you can just peruse and look at. But yeah, the Doc Journey course and the Doc Journey app represent a sequence of learning and teaching that will give you the tools to actually find out your own solution to pain.
Yes, and we're gonna put the direct link to this resource page so people will easily find all the information that they need. David, this was amazing. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your experience and your knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. No, I really enjoyed it.
So, that was Dr. David Hanscom. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you leave a review so we can reach even more people who should be hearing these lessons. Also, hit that subscribe button on whatever platform you're using to tune in. That being said, if you or someone close to you is currently injured or recovering from an injury, make sure you check out my book, Heal Beyond Expectations. It's really the most complete step-by-step manual on how to apply my mindful injury recovery method. It is also a memoir of my own experience, both with my own injuries and trauma and helping other people overcome theirs. So you can find out more about it on healbeyondexpectations.com or, of course, directly on Amazon if you search for Heal Beyond Expectations. Of course, if you want to go even deeper, you can find out more about the various self-paced programs on my main website, mynovak.com. And there are also coaching options if you prefer a more personalized approach and would like to work with me one-on-one.